was 1962, the height of the Cold War, a moment when unrelenting anxiety about the future was leavened by an abiding faith in the power of science to secure our safety and prosperity. Then came an incendiary book that sowed seeds of doubt.
This is one of the nation's bestsellers, first printed on September 27, 1962. Up to now, 500,000 copies have been sold, and Silent Spring has been called the most controversial book of the year.
At the eye of the storm was Rachel Carson, one of the most celebrated American writers of her time. With her first 3 books, a lyrical trilogy about the sea, Carson had opened people's eyes to the natural world. Now, in Silent Spring, she delivered the dark warning that they might soon destroy it.
If we are ever to solve the basic problem of environmental contamination, we must begin to count the many hidden costs of what we are doing.
Ms. Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man. Whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
It was sort of the gospel at the time that human ingenuity would triumph over nature. What Carson was arguing was for caution. She really confronted the orthodoxies of her time.
She was accused of being a communist, of being a hysterical female Luddite. The reaction was to attack the messenger.
Carson was an unlikely heretic, dutiful, demure, and so jealous of her solitude that her most intimate relationship was conducted mainly through letters. She thrust herself into the public eye, all the while harboring a secret that was literally killing her. To some, Silent Spring was an act of heroism. To others, an irresponsible breach of scientific objectivity. But there could be no dispute that with her rebuke to modern technological science, Carson had shattered a paradigm.
Rachel Carson not only changed the kind of questions we ask about the environment, I think she caused us to start to ask those questions. She's the instigator.
In mid-July 1945, as the Second World War ground on in the Pacific, and weary Americans scanned the morning's headlines for the word victory, Rachel Carson was trying to call attention to what she believed was a war against the Earth. Carson was 38 that summer and restless. A writer by inclination and a biologist by training, she'd spent much of the previous decade in the employ of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, overseeing publications about its conservation work. The job paid the bills, but Carson craved a wider audience. Now, the agency had undertaken a study she felt warranted public attention. As she put it in a letter to the popular monthly Reader's Digest, practically at my back door in Maryland, an experiment of more than ordinary interest and importance is going on. On a vast forested tract at the Patuxent Research Refuge, not far from Carson's home in Silver Spring, fish and wildlife scientists had begun to examine the environmental impacts of a relatively new chemistry lab creation, a so-called synthetic pesticide known as DDT.
Diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. It was first synthesized back in the 19th century, and it sat on lab shelves for decades. Nobody knew if it did anything, if it had any useful purpose, until 1939, when a Swiss chemist named Paul Muller discovered that it was a very potent insecticide. It killed all kinds of bugs very readily.
Absorbed through the feet or other parts of the body, DDT affects the nervous system and motor coordination of the insect. Several hours elapse before symptoms develop. Then in sequence follow restlessness, tremors, convulsions, paralysis, and death.
Farmers have been doing war with insects and other pests for a long time, and they had been using what we think of now as almost obviously homicidal poisons to do that. But for the first time, we have a sort of new generation pesticide. It's a whole new fascinating kind of chemical formula that's not obviously toxic to people. And insects are dying all over the place.
After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military had rushed DDT to the battle zones in an effort to protect American troops from insect-borne diseases such as typhus, which was spread by lice and left untreated could kill.
This was Naples, Italy, shortly after the Allied occupation. Its crowded population lacked almost everything for the safeguarding of public health. The perfect setup for epidemic.
Naples is really a city under siege, and typhus spreads quickly under those kinds of conditions. So they set up spray stations in the cities, spraying thousands of people a day with hand sprayers, people who wanted to get sprayed, people who didn't want to get sprayed, children, elderly.
Next, the 40,000 Italians dwelling in the jam-packed air raid shelters were deloused.
In all, more than 1 million people were dusted with DDT, and the epidemic was stopped in its tracks. Neapolitans, the New York Times reported, are now throwing DDT at brides instead of rice. Meanwhile, in the tropical Pacific theater, where more soldiers had been sidelined by malaria than by gunshot wounds, entire islands were saturated with DDT.
General Douglas MacArthur once said that in war, an army commander had 3 divisions, one in the front fighting, one in reserve, and one in the rear being refitted. He said, I have one in the front, one in reserve, and one in the hospital because of malaria. But with DDT, that problem diminished substantially. It was considered to be a miracle substance in that it saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
By the middle of 1944, Time magazine had pronounced DDT one of the great scientific discoveries of World War II. To Reader's Digest, Rachel Carson was offering a new angle, a piece exploring DDT's potential to cause collateral damage to wildlife.
Biologists with the Fish and Wildlife Service begin to see pretty quickly that when DDT is used in certain areas, there's evidence of problems. There's evidence of fish kill or bird kill. And they see that. And like any expert, they publish it in a place where other experts will read it. But how that information then filters out to a larger public is a very big question.
Carson understood the implications of this. She wanted to write a story warning people that we need to be a little bit careful with this. This looks like it's a great thing, but we maybe need to be cautious in how we use it, how much of it we use.
But Reader's Digest doesn't want this article. They essentially say, oh, housewives would be just turned off by this. They wouldn't want to know about this terrible stuff. So no, thank you.
So as you can see, you know, a lot of things were going on in the country at that time. A lot of people were becoming more aware of some of the harmful effects of some of these pesticides and what it did to wildlife. And there's a lot of more of that video that you can watch where it basically shows, you know, how it went through Congress and the government and other people, very famous people and people with a lot of power got involved and, you know, actually got some things started because of Rachel Carson. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and start with the introduction part of it. Like I said, just to kind of give you an idea. The video shows you kind of where the whole environmental movement started. And then we'll show you how Master Farmer kind of got involved with that. So this year's brought a lot of changes. I mean, a lot of changes between our storms and COVID. You know, there's a lot of meeting online now. It's mask mandates. You know, for a while, like everybody else, the Ag Center was basically shut down. And then we were very limited on going back to work and interacting, and we're still limited. And like in that picture on the left with the cat, it feels like it's April 94th. You know, it's just like this year has drug on and drug on. You know, but one thing that hasn't changed basically is agriculture. You know, if you talk to any farmers or any of you are farmers, you've had to keep going. You plant, you spray, you know, you're harvesting, you're doing everything that you did before, regardless of COVID. And the reason is because people depend on you. You know, you feed the country, you feed the world. You know, you don't have time to stop for a pandemic. Another thing the pandemic has done, and Sarah, I'm sure would agree, is it's actually encouraged a lot of people to do their own gardening and to explore growing crops and growing their own food where maybe they hadn't before, because this year they've actually had time. So one thing the pandemic has done is actually encouraged a lot of people to get involved into that side of it. So again, where it began, Silent Spring, there was a lot of DDT. A lot of swimming areas and beaches were closed, as you can see in some of those pictures. The Love Canal in New York actually had 10,000 tons of toxic waste. In that bottom right-hand corner picture, you can see that gets in the newspaper. Even back then, that gets, you know, on TV, it gets on the radio. People pay attention to stuff like that. So the passage of the Clean Water Act and the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, occurred around in 1972. So a lot of things led up to this. So what was the act of the Clean Water? What was the goal of the Clean Water Act? I'm sorry. It is a primary federal law in the United States governing water pollution, and that's throughout the whole United States. The goal is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of all U.S. waters. It was enacted in 1948, so it has been around a long time, but modifications in 1972, with everything that was going on at the time, renamed it the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. So the Clean Water Act discusses two types of pollutants. The first one is what's called point source, and it's just like it sounds. It originates from a stationary location or a fixed facility where the pollutants are discharged directly into a water body. They call them end of the pipe. As you can see in some of those pictures, water is directly coming from a pipe. It's coming from, excuse me, where the cows, the discharge is coming from the lot where the cows are. This comes from municipalities and wastewater treatment plants, CAFOs, and active oil fields. So this is something, again, they regulate this through permits. They know exactly where that pollution is coming from. Everything else falls into what we call non-point source pollution. This does not have a single point of origin, and they're not introduced into a specific stream or outlet. So that basically covers agriculture. Anytime you're spraying golf courses, your yard, you know, runoff from parking lots, runoff from agricultural fields. There's a lot of different things, including natural sources, that make up non-point source pollution, which obviously makes it different because you can't point to one specific thing and say this is contributing to it. It's all sources. As you can see from this little diagram, you have non-point source and point sources, whether it comes from your subdivision, whether it comes from cropland, from a feedlot, factories. If they're not addressed, all of this pollution can get into our water bodies and cause water quality issues. Now, non-point source pollution accounts for more than 50% of the pollution in U.S. waters. And you can take a look at the little graph on the left, basically showing in the estuaries, lakes, and rivers across the country, it's a significant problem that we have, and a problem that has been addressed and is being addressed today. So what does that have to do with us? This is a land use map. I'm sure you remember seeing it probably in junior high or high school, just showing you basically what our state is used for. Well, if you look at it, if you take a step back and look at it, most of it is agriculture and forestry, grassland, cropland. So when we have water quality issues, where do you think the agencies and DEQ and EPA, as well as the public, who do you think they're going to look at? They're going to look at agriculture as being, part of the problem. So the first 25 years of the Clean Water Act, it focused on the end of the pipe, point source. Again, that was the easiest thing to do. You could regulate it through permits. Everyone else, the non-point source pollution, was basically exempted from regulation. This was managed by voluntary implementation of BMPs. So what was the result of the Clean Water Act? They found over 42,000 impaired water bodies across the United States. 43% are from pathogens and nutrients, which most of the time people correlate to agriculture. And in Louisiana, 73% of the assessed rivers and streams are considered impaired. That's pretty significant. So what are the requirements of the Clean Water Act? And you got to wonder, why is that important? Why does that have any impact on you or your operation? Well, it really does. States have to develop lists of impaired waters. They have to identify pollution reductions needed to meet standards, reductions from both point and non-point source. So again, in the past, they were only looking at the point source, the municipalities, the wastewater treatment plants. Now they're looking at everyone. Anyone that has the potential to contribute contaminants into water bodies is being evaluated. And they have to develop TMDLs and plans that will lead to the Clean Water Act goals. So what is a TMDL? You may or may not have ever heard of it. They actually kind of call it a pollution budget. It stands for total maximum daily load, which means it's the maximum amount of pollution from all sources that can enter a water body and still comply with water quality standards. It's required for waters not meeting state standards, and EPA must approve these. This is just a little graph that kind of shows you the process in the development of the TMDLs. And basically, they start out with monitoring first. They monitor the waters and streams, the lakes. This is done by different agencies. You have DEQ and EPA. LDAF does some monitoring. So the waters are monitored. They look to see if they're healthy, what types of fish and habitat are able to thrive in those waters. They do an assessment to determine if they're impaired or not, basically taking water samples and things like that. They develop the TMDL, so they develop a plan determining point source and non-point source loads for impaired water. So how much pollution can enter that specific water body, that lake, that stream, that river, and it still meets state water quality standards. Then they have the plans, prescribes BMPs to reduce non-point source loading. So the point source, they can regulate that, because if too much point source pollution is being allowed to water body, they basically scale that back. The permit, tells them that they have to reduce the amount of pollutants that's going into that water. Well, you can't really do that with non-point source. But this is the development process for the TMDLs that they're putting together. So all point, non-point contributors, cropland, pasture land, animal operations, forested areas, other industry contributions, homeowners, whether that's when you're building a house and there's construction and there's bare soil, whether that means spraying your yard, putting fertilizer. You also have municipalities with sewage treatment plants. So all contributors are included. The ones that we really are going to focus on, we're going to talk a little bit about today, are the non-point source pollutants that come from ag and forestry. That includes primarily sediments, nutrients, pesticides, oil and grease, and animal waste. Now, there are other contaminants, but these are the ones that really can cause problems in our surface waters. Excuse me. There's a lot of other states, obviously, that go through the same thing that we do. There's not one state in this country that's exempt from water quality issues. Everybody kind of has a different scenario that they have to deal with. Kentucky passed a Water Quality Act, basically, to protect the surface and groundwater resources from agriculture and silviculture activities. So they know that their waters are polluted. There's a lot of agriculture, obviously, in Kentucky, and they passed this Water Quality Act to try to reduce the amount of nutrients and pathogens and everything that we're getting into their waters. So what does it require? It requires farmers with 10 or more acres used for agroforestry to implement a water quality plan. The word required is underlined because that's not an option. You don't get to say, I don't want to do it, or I'll do it later. If you have 10 or more acres, you have to have a water quality plan, and you have to implement it within 5 years. I looked on their website, actually. This was something that said if you own 10 or more acres in Boone County, even if you don't practice agriculture on your property. So obviously it's widespread. They're wanting everyone to comply with this. And as of 2010, there was over 61,000 self-certifications on file. So I'm sure 10 years later, there's much more than that. So there's a lot of people that are on board with this. North Carolina, I don't know if you've ever visited there. It's a beautiful state. They have a lot of very scenic rivers and streams and estuaries and things like that a lot of people go visit. They had high levels of nutrients were found in this river basin. So what did they do? This Environmental Management Commission basically established a goal of reducing the annual loading of nitrogen from all sources, not just agriculture, but from, subdivisions, from municipalities, whatever. They wanted to reduce that annual nitrogen loading by a minimum of 30%. The rules were developed. They are now law. Because you see in that picture on the right, millions of dead fish cover the coast of the Neuse River. This is what makes it to the news, to the social media, to the newspapers. When things like that happen, people pay attention. Again, this was implemented in 1997. It applies to persons who apply fertilizer to 50 more acres of land per year. Again, it doesn't state. You may be applying that to 50 acres of pasture or peach trees. It doesn't even state what you're putting it on. But if you apply fertilizer to 50 acres of land or more per year, or you manage 50 acres of land, this applies to you. You have to implement a nutrient management plan for all properties where the nutrients are applied. So again, it's not an option. Well, can it happen here? We have over 1.2 million acres that are irrigated across the state. If you look at it, roughly 500,000 acres of rice and crawfish statewide, which obviously are irrigated. But in Calcasieu Parish, several years ago, they passed an ordinance prohibiting draining of fields into road ditches. Well, why did they do that? Because a lot of the sediment that was coming out of these rice fields that was being pumped off was basically accumulating in the roadside ditches and the canals, and they were building up and obstructing those canals and those ditches from flowing freely. So it was backing up and flooding the roads and flooding other property. So Calcasieu Parish passed this ordinance basically prohibiting this. It is a misdemeanor offense, which again, you can have 30 days in jail or $500 for each offense. So we don't have the regulation that many other states have. We don't have it nearly as bad as California and some of these other states. But with all the rain that we get here and all the water bodies that we have here and all of the agriculture and forestry we have here, it's something that we have to address. Because clean water is everyone's goal. If you look at some of these pictures on the left, it's very easy to find this information where, people are putting up signs, water is life, rollback of the clean water rules. Everyone wants clean water. Now, some of them have their own agenda why they want clean water, but regardless, it's all of our goals to have clean water, and we need to do whatever we can to address that from an agricultural perspective. So what does that have to do with Master Farmer? That kind of leads us up to the point where about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, when the TMDLs were being implemented, they actually began over in the Mermentau area, the southwestern part of the state, because of all of the rice farming that was going on. They wanted to have some type of program, first of all, that was voluntary. That's the main thing. It's always been voluntary, and as far as we know, it will always be voluntary. But basically have some type of program where producers could participate, learn about some of the water quality issues that needed to be addressed, look at demonstrations of people's farms and things like that, where BMPs are being discussed and demonstrated, and actually put that into practice by developing and implementing a comprehensive conservation plan. So a committee was formed, and the 5 partners that we work with extensively, the Ag Center, Farm Bureau, the Cattlemen's Association, Department of Ag and Forestry, and we couldn't do this program without NRCS, obviously for different reasons. But anyway, they're very, very involved in this program. So all of these people got together to put this program together for you. And it was based on watersheds. As you can see, this is a map of the 12 major watersheds that we have across the state. The program was actually taught by watershed in the beginning. It started in the Mermentau, and then it's moved around the state. And now these trainings are held just kind of as needed. So the objective of the program was basically a multi-agency effort looking at helping ag producers voluntarily address environmental concerns related to production agriculture while becoming more sustainable. And that's something that you've probably read, especially over the last few years, about sustainability, about the products in the grocery store, about, the sources of where they came from, them being produced sustainably and things like that. So sustainable is kind of the buzzword in the last couple of years of what people are trying to become. And this program is hopefully giving you some of the tools to be more sustainable on your own operation. The phase 1 is what we're doing today. We used to conduct it at the parish or multi-parish level. Some of the topics we talked about, or we're going to talk about, include the Clean Water Act, information on your watershed and scenic rivers and why that's important, to your farm. We're going to talk a little bit about best management practices. And NRCS is going to talk about conservation planning and the plan that's required to be certified in the Master Farmer Program. And there's other topics as well, but this is kind of what was discussed and put together even 20 years ago as topics that you need to be aware of. Phase 2 is attending a BMP demonstration field day or workshop. Conservation, water quality, BMPs are discussed or demonstrated, as we said. Some of these are on the research stations where we've had our field days. Some of these are NRCS pasture walks and soil quality workshops that they've had across the state over the last 15 years that we've been doing it. But it also fulfills continuing education credits. So attending one of these demonstrations or field days or workshops will give you credit for phase 2. Phase 3 is actually working within RCS, the district conservationist, and the conservation district to develop and implement a resource management system conservation plan on your entire farming operation that you have control of. And I know that Steve Nepper within RCS is going to talk about the planning process later on in this training. But, that's something that we encourage you to take advantage of, is that technical assistance. So having them come out and look at your farm and developing that plan with you. This addresses any resource concerns you may have for soil, water, plants, animals, air, and people. So once you complete those 3 phases, you actually receive a certification. The Commissioner of Agriculture, Commissioner Strain, is the one that certifies you and the land for 5 years. The producer, once they complete all the requirements, you're recognized at a luncheon at the annual Louisiana Conservation District meeting, and you receive a sign and a plaque, as you see with the people in the picture below. This was at one of the meetings a few years ago, and you must complete 6 hours of CECs per year to maintain certification, which basically is like 2 functions, maybe a field day and a training or a workshop. And you have to submit that kind of I don't want to say self-certify, but basically you fill out a submission form and send it in stating what 2 activities that you attended for your CECs that year. These are just some of the things that count for continuing education once you are certified. Usually we do have a sign-in sheet at most of these activities. The commodity conferences at Annual Farm Bureau, our research station field days, Forage and Grassland Council Forage Tour, which they change that to different locations around the state every year. The Conservation Tillage Conference, which rotates usually between Baton Rouge and now I believe it's Memphis. along with the annual meeting of the Louisiana Association of Conservation Districts Convention, which there's other ones that can be added to this list. This was just some that, we know every year are held, and they do count for continuing education. But there are several things. It shouldn't be hard for people to have that CEC every year because there's a lot of things that are available. So to summarize it, basically this is an educational program. What's different about Master Farmer in Louisiana versus some of the other environmental programs in other states, and they do have them, this one actually has the education, the demonstration, and you actually implement what you've learned. You're implementing whatever practices you need on your farm to address resource concerns. It's documented, and you become certified. So it's not just the education, but you're actually implementing that plan as well. Certified producers are in presumed compliance of state soil and water quality standards. What that means is back in, I think it was 2001 or 2002, it passed through our Louisiana legislature unopposed and basically stated if a producer completes all the requirements, all three phases, it's documented, they're in presumed compliance of our state soil and water quality standards, which means you're documenting everything and doing everything you can do to address environmental concerns on your farm. I think that says a lot. The legislators felt very strongly that this was a good program. It was a proactive program. And if a producer goes to the trouble to get certified, then he should have a limited amount of protection, basically saying you're in presumed compliance. So there is that, but basically you're being proactive and an industry leader. As of this past January, there's about 3,600 people that are participating in the program over the last 19 years. And we have about 288, I think, or close to it, that are certified. So, there's not a lot of people that are certified considering how many people participate. But the reason is you're not just being educated, you're actually putting that plan into place. So, and how quickly you go through certification depends on a lot of things. It depends on you, how big your operation is, how many resources you may have to address, and so forth. We actually do have a website. If you get on the Ag Center website and type in Master Farmer, it will bring you to that page. We have a Facebook page that we update pretty regular with any trainings, field days, pictures, and things like that, that you can get more information there as well.